John 10:6 says parable. So why do we say John has no parables? In our last video, we made a claim that surprised a lot of you. The Gospel of John has no parables. Not one. Matthew has more than 20. Luke has more than 30. Mark is full of them. And then John opens his Gospel with cosmic poetry about the Word becoming flesh, and never once tells a story about a sower, a prodigal son, or a wedding banquet the way the other three Gospels do. Hundreds of you did not let that claim slide. You sent us straight to John chapter 10, verse 6, where the King James Version uses the word parable in plain English. You pointed to the vine in John 15. You pointed to the water turned to wine in John 2. Some of you were polite about it, some of you were not. All of you deserved a real answer, so here it is. Before we go any further, if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it. Because we are about to walk through a piece of New Testament Greek that most translations quietly smooth over. And once you see it, you will start noticing it every time you open John's Gospel. Subscribe now so the next video in this series on who actually wrote this Gospel lands in your feed the day it goes up. A quick recap for anyone just joining us. The original argument was simple. When the Greek New Testament wants to say parable in the sense that Matthew, Mark, and Luke use it, a short story about a sower, a lost sheep, a wedding feast, it uses the word parable. That word appears close to 50 times across the three synoptic Gospels. It appears exactly 0 times in John. Not once. That is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of counting. So when John 10:6 says, "In English, this parable spake Jesus unto them," it is fair to ask, doesn't that disprove the whole premise in one verse? This is where the story gets interesting, because the Greek word sitting behind that English translation is not parable at all. It is a completely different word. Paroimia. 2 Greek words, 1 English word. Here is the problem in a nutshell. English only has one common word for this kind of figurative speech: parable. So translators reach for it whenever Jesus says something that is not meant to be taken literally. But New Testament Greek had 2 distinct words, and the Gospel writers were not careless about which one they used. Parable literally means something thrown alongside another thing, a comparison built as a narrative. It has characters. It has a plot, even if a short one. The sower scatters seed on 4 kinds of soil. A father runs to embrace a son who wasted his inheritance. 10 women wait for a bridegroom with lamps that either have oil or do not. These are stories, and stories were Jesus' primary teaching tool to the crowds in Galilee and Judea, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Paroimia is a different animal. It means a dark saying, a proverb, a riddle-like figure of speech, sometimes an extended metaphor. But critically, it is not built as a plot with characters moving through events. It is closer to what we might call an enigmatic illustration than a short story. And in the entire New Testament, this word appears in exactly one place outside of one general reference, in 2 Peter, the Gospel of John. It shows up in John 10:6, John 16:25, and John 16:29. That is the complete list. 3 times, 1 author, 1 Gospel. So when the King James translators rendered paroimia as parable in John 10:6, they were not wrong in a casual sense. The words are related in meaning. But they were flattening a distinction that the original author went out of his way to preserve. John had access to the word parable. Every other Gospel writer used it constantly. John chose a different word, consistently, every single time he described this kind of speech from Jesus. That is not an accident of vocabulary. That is a decision. One more piece of the puzzle strengthens this even further. And it came up in the comments too, from a viewer who correctly noted that proverb and parable share the same root idea. That connection is not a coincidence, and it points somewhere useful. In the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, which was the Bible most Greek-speaking Jews and early Christians actually read, the book of Proverbs is titled paroimia. Same word family John reaches for. That book is built almost entirely out of short, punchy, often riddle-like sayings, compressed, enigmatic on first hearing, requiring reflection rather than following a plot. That is the literary tradition John is drawing on when he uses paroimia for Jesus' upper room teaching. The tradition of proverbs and wisdom sayings, not the tradition of the story parables Jesus told beside the Sea of Galilee. Once you see that connection, John's word choice looks even less like an accident and more like a deliberate literary signal to any Greek-speaking reader who knew their scriptures. This is wisdom sayings language, not crowd story language. What Jesus said about his own method, in his own words. The most remarkable part of this entire discussion is that Jesus himself draws this exact distinction, and John records him doing it. In John 16-25, Jesus tells his disciples, "These things have I spoken unto you in Proverbs. But the time cometh, when I shall no more speak unto you in Proverbs, but I shall show you plainly of the Father." The word translated Proverbs, there is our word, paroimia. 4 verses later, in John 16:29, the disciples respond, "Lo, now speakest thou plainly, and speakest no proverb." Same word again. Read that exchange carefully, and something remarkable emerges. Jesus is explicitly telling his disciples that his paroimia-style speech is a temporary mode, one that is about to give way to plain, direct speech about the Father. He never says this about parable, about the story parables recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those stories were addressed to crowds. And Jesus explains elsewhere in Matthew 13 and Mark 4 that the parables carried a dual function. They revealed truth to those who were ready to receive it, while leaving those who were not ready outside the meaning. Hearing a story without grasping what it pointed to. Several of you brought up that exact passage in the comments, quoting Mark 4:11. "Unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables." That is precisely the point. Parable, as the synoptics use it, is public-facing speech with a built-in filter. It requires a private explanation afterward, which is why Mark tells us Jesus expounded all things to his disciples, once the crowd had gone. The paroimia sayings in John function almost in reverse. They are private from the start, addressed to the 11 remaining disciples in a locked room on the last night of Jesus' earthly ministry, with no crowd present to filter out. There is no follow-up explanation seen in John the way there is in Mark 4, because none is needed. Jesus tells the disciples plainly that the riddle-like season of his teaching is ending and open speech about the Father is beginning. That is a completely different literary and theological function than the crowd-facing parable of the other Gospels. And it is exactly why John reserved a separate word for it, rather than reaching for the term everyone else was already using. The examples you brought us. Read fairly. Let's go through the specific passages many of you raised, because you deserve a straight answer on each one rather than a dismissal. The door and the Good Shepherd. John chapter 10. This is the passage that actually uses the word paroimia in verse 6, so in one sense, you were right to bring it up. There absolutely is a paroimia here. Jesus describes himself as the door of the sheep and the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. It has vivid imagery. It has a scene you can picture, a sheepfold, a thief climbing over the wall instead of entering through the gate, a hired hand who runs when the wolf comes. But notice what it does not have. It does not have a plot that resolves. Nobody in the illustration takes an action and receives a consequence the way the prodigal son does, or the way the unforgiving servant does in Matthew 18. It is an extended metaphor about identity, who Jesus is, rather than a narrative about a choice and its outcome. That is the shape of a paroimia, not a parable, even though English translations use the same word for both. The true vine. John chapter 15. This is one of the most quoted passages in John, and many of you pointed to it as an obvious parable. Look closely at the text, though, and you will notice John never once calls it a parable, a paroimia, or anything else. It simply is an extended metaphor delivered as direct teaching. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. There is no story here in the sense of characters moving through a sequence of events. There is an image, unpacked and applied line by line. Branches, fruit, pruning, abiding. This is closer to what the Psalms and wisdom literature do than to what Matthew's parables do. It is figurative language without question. It is a parable in the loose, everyday English sense of the word. But it is not a parable in the technical, Greek, synoptic sense. And John, notably, never labels it with either Greek term. He just lets Jesus speak plainly, in the first person, as the thing itself, rather than telling a story about someone else who represents him. Water into wine. John chapter 2. A number of you raised this one, and it deserves special attention because it is actually a different category altogether, not a parable of either kind, but what John explicitly calls a sign. John uses the Greek word semeion for the miracles in his gospel. Turning water to wine, healing the nobleman's son, feeding the 5,000, healing the man born blind, raising Lazarus. John tells us plainly, at the end of chapter 20, why he included these. These are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. A sign is not a story Jesus tells. It is an event Jesus performs, and John invites the reader to interpret its meaning the same way you would interpret a parable, symbolically pointing beyond itself. But it belongs to an entirely different genre. Confusing signs with parables is an easy mistake to make because both function symbolically, but they are structurally nothing alike. One is a spoken story. The other is a witnessed event. Why the distinction actually matters. At this point, you might be thinking, fine, this is a vocabulary lesson, but does it change anything theologically? It does, and here is why. The four Gospels were not written to four identical audiences with four identical goals. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are largely built around Jesus' public ministry. Sermons on hillsides, crowds by the lake, debates in the temple courts. Parable was the tool suited for that setting. Memorable, layered, able to be understood on multiple levels by multiple kinds of listeners, some of whom were not ready to accept what they heard. John's Gospel, by contrast, spends an enormous portion of its content, nearly a third of the entire book, inside a single room, on a single night, with 11 men who had already spent 3 years with Jesus and were about to watch him die. That is not crowd teaching. That is farewell instruction to people who no longer needed to be taught in riddles designed to filter out the uncommitted. They needed clarity, because within hours they would be scattered, afraid, and left to carry a message they barely understood yet. That shift in audience explains the shift in genre far more convincingly than any theory about John upgrading or replacing the synoptic method. John is not competing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, correcting them or rendering their parables obsolete. He is recording a different stretch of Jesus' ministry, addressed to a different audience, using the vocabulary his own language offered him for that kind of speech. And he was precise enough, 3 separate times, to reach for a specific word instead of the common one everyone else was using. There is a wider observation buried underneath all of this, and it is worth sitting with. The absence of parabole in John is not an absence of figurative language. John is arguably the most symbolically dense gospel of the 4. Water, bread, light, the shepherd, the vine, the door, birth from above, living water at the well in Samaria. What John removes is not imagery. It is the story form specifically. The plotted narrative parable aimed at a mixed public crowd. What he keeps and intensifies is direct symbolic identification. Not, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed, but, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the true vine. Every one of those statements skips the third-person story structure entirely and puts Jesus himself in the center of the image, speaking in the first person. That is not a smaller use of figurative language than the synoptics. In some ways, it is a bolder one, because there is no character standing in for Jesus in these images. Jesus does not tell a story about a shepherd. He says he is the shepherd. So when someone tells you there are plenty of parables in John, the most honest response is not to say they are wrong. It is to say they are using the English word correctly and the Greek word loosely. And once you separate the two, everything in John's Gospel gets easier to read on its own terms rather than being measured against a yardstick borrowed from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What this means for how you read the 4th Gospel. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Stop reading John, looking for parables that match the shape of Matthew 13, because you will keep coming up empty and frustrated, the same way many commenters did. Instead, read John looking for 2 separate categories, doing 2 separate kinds of work. Look for the paroimia sayings, The handful of enigmatic, extended illustrations addressed to the inner circle, almost all of them clustered around the upper room in chapters 10 and 14 through 16. And look for the signs. The 7 public miracles John selects and interprets for you, each one pointing toward a specific claim about who Jesus is. Between those two categories, you get a gospel that is not missing figurative language at all. It is running a different kind of figurative language, tuned for a different purpose, at a different stage in Jesus' ministry, for a different audience than the crowds who needed the sower and the mustard seed. That is also, frankly, a better answer than either side gave in the comments last time. It is not true that John has plenty of parables, exactly like the other Gospels. It is also not fully true that John has none at all in any sense of the word. The honest answer sits in the Greek, in a word most English readers never get to see, and in an author who was careful enough to use it exactly 3 times in exactly the right context and nowhere else. This also has a practical payoff the next time you sit down with a study Bible or lead a small group through John's Gospel. When you hit chapter 10 and someone in the room says, "Wait, doesn't this verse call it a parable?" You now have an answer that does not require dismissing the question or pretending it was never asked. You can show them the footnote if their translation has one, pointing to paroimia, and you can walk them through the same 3 references we just covered, John 10:6, John 16:25, and John 16:29, as the complete data set. That is the kind of detail that turns a passing comment section disagreement into an actual moment of discovery. And it is exactly the kind of close reading this channel exists to do. Not settling arguments by asserting an opinion louder, but going back to the actual words on the page and letting them settle it. It is also worth saying plainly that being wrong about a detail like this is not a failure of faith or failure of reading the Bible seriously. Quite the opposite. Every single comment that pushed back on the original claim was doing exactly what careful readers of Scripture are supposed to do. Checking a claim against the text instead of accepting it because a video said so. That instinct is worth more than getting every detail right on the first pass. The goal here was never to win an argument in the comments. It was to get the 2 of us, the channel and the people watching, a little closer to what the text actually says, together, one word at a time. Where we go from here? That leaves an even bigger question hanging over everything we have just covered, and a lot of you raised it in the comments too. Who actually wrote this gospel? Some of you said the Apostle John. Some of you said John Mark. One comment argued it was actually Lazarus, the disciple whom Jesus loved, writing under a different name. Others pointed out, correctly, that the text itself never names its author, and that the attribution to John comes from the early church rather than from the manuscript itself. That is not a small detail to wave away, and it deserves its own full treatment rather than a rushed answer here. If this kind of close reading is useful to you, going back to the Greek, checking the claims against the text instead of assuming either side of a comment argument is automatically right. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next video takes on that authorship question directly, with the same standard. No claim gets made here without showing you exactly where it comes from in the text. Before you go, here is a question worth sitting with, and I would genuinely like to read your answer in the comments. Of the 3 passages we just covered, the Good Shepherd, the true vine, or the water turned to wine, which one did you assume was a parable before this video? And which gospel do you think shaped that assumption? Drop it below. We read every one of them, and the best answers shape what we cover next.